And so what did day to day look like managing both the impact theory and Tom's socials?
There was like content creation, obviously. Then there was breaking down the analytics. Um, so like looking at what we had posted, seeing what performed best, like doing more of that, kind of like looking at the insights. And then at the time, similar to when I was at Candler, I had no experience doing social. So I was figuring it out. So there's a large part of kind of like reverse engineering with the most successful accounts. At the time, we were like mostly focused on Instagram because that's where we were getting the most growth from. But so I was like looking at like big accounts like Andy Frizella or other big successful like Instagram influencers like in our niche, what they were doing and trying to figure out like what can I learn from this person. But as far as the content creation, I mean, there's a lot that goes into it. But like it's like break finding clips, so like going through like the latest like keynote that Tom has done and like breaking that down into like things that are really clippable and that I think would do well. Working with the editors to like put those clips together, right? Like edit them, like finding the right title for that clip, like sourcing a bunch of quote cards from like some of Tom's transcripts, or I think towards the beginning, like Tom was really hands on as far as captions as well. So it's like like working with him, like to put together the captions or get the captions from him. And then it's like we were doing two posts a day on Tom's account, so like scheduling those on all of his different like Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, and towards the end like TikTok. Um, but so it's like, yeah, if you have more specific questions, happy to answer it. But it's like there was like a lot.
Yeah, and so what was posting volume like? Like I've met and interviewed a bunch of people that work for Team Gary. So I'm curious like one, like what the volume was like and how how you kind of handled all of that volume. Cause you said it was still a pretty small team at the time. Like Team Gary and I'm pretty sure was like 30 people. And you said all of Impact Theater when you started was around 10. So like what was the volume like and how did you keep up with that volume?
Yeah. So for social media, it was just me as far as managing the pages. We did, and then we had like I was working with like an editor um in house who was also working on other stuff. Um, but but I guess you want to know kind of like what the team looked like overall, not just for social, right?
Well, no, just from a social perspective, like what was the volume? Like what was your I'll reframe it. What was your like posting schedule like? Like were you trying to post like 3 times a day or was it once a day, different times on different platforms? Like what was the schedule like?
Yeah, so it was twice a day. We had like one like a morning post around like between like 7 and 8 a.m. And then we had like an afternoon post around 3 p.m. For most of, and we tested a bunch of different times as well. And because it was just me, we were mostly, like I said, focused on Instagram. And then what I did is I basically took the assets that we like optimized for Instagram and repurposed those on the other platforms, kind of in like the best format for those platforms. So like at the time, like on LinkedIn and Twitter, for example, like text only worked pretty well. We had figured out, and so I would take like the caption from Tom from like a something that might have had a picture or video, and I would just use the text, and I would like probably edit it a little bit just so it made sense like as a standalone. Um, Facebook and Instagram was like usually like kind of like the same stuff, and then um, later when TikTok came along, that was like a whole other strategy to figure out.
And was there like a review process in place? Like did like you said Tom was pretty hands-on, especially with captions at the beginning, but like what did the review process eventually about turn into? Like was did you have to send all the content in advance to Tom or how did that work?
No, I actually had like free range on the content itself. Um, as far as like the captions. So basically the review as far as the captions, what happened is I would create the assets and I would text them to him. It's funny because like he's so busy, so I was like always like chasing him for like to get like captions. And so like it was very very simple. Just we would text like iMessage, and I'd send him like the numbers. Like I'd have like 10 posts that I need a caption for, and I'd say like one and send the asset, two send the asset, three send the asset, and he would text back. He would just text back like one with the caption, and like that's how it worked. And it's funny because like we tried a bunch of different ways, but like we had him like fill it in a spreadsheet and stuff. But like at the end of the day, since he's so busy, like the texting just worked well because like he could have been in an Uber or like waiting in a line somewhere, and he just like whipped out his phone and like he could write caption, you know. So it's like,
I think that's so funny because you think like, especially with someone like Tom, be like this big fancy process to get it reviewed and everything, but it's literally just texting. I think that's so funny. And with those clips specifically that you're sending to him, you said you're kind of evaluating, you're watching his keynotes and stuff like that. What were you looking for? What made a good clip that you're like, that's a moment, and then you get that cut into a clip?
yeah, it's a good question. It's funny because like you kind of develop a sense, like a third sense about those things, where it's kind of like an emotional thing. And I think that honestly, I think having ADD like really helps like with that third sense because like as soon as you're watching something, like I can feel like when my attention is dropping, you know. But like I also feel like whenever something is like so freaking engaging, like I just know I'm like cut in my mind. I'm like cut, you know, like this is a clip right here, and yeah, I don't know. There's something about like I there's like a and maybe it's not just me, you know. It's like I'm sure like it's anyone can do that, but it's like I think also as you put out more and more stuff out, um, you start to you start to understand like what's gonna work and or not, or like what your audience really resonates with, you know. So it's gonna I think you build it with experience. Yeah.
And what were some of those things that over time you started to notice always did well? Was it always a clip from Impact Theory? Was it always those pictures of Tom holding the whiteboard with the stuff written on? And like, what over time did you start to realize was always some of the stuff that performed well with his audience?
Yeah, so you hit it right on the needle. The whiteboard thing is something that we tried out like in the beginning, and it just worked. Like I think they call it like UGC, like user generated content. I don't know if that's actually not the right word, but um like stuff that feels authentic, like comparing that to like a quote card, where it's just like Photoshop, it just resonates so much more on Instagram because it feels real. So it feels more real, authentic. You know, it feels like Tom like wrote the whiteboard just like a lesson that day for the audience. You know, and and we just tested. I mean, we were testing different stuff out all the time, right? And but like when that hit, like it just like got like double the engagement that a no regular post would get. And we're like, whoa, something's there. We tried it again and it kept working. And so we just like that ended up being like one of our pillar kind of like piece like pillar formats just because it worked so well. And we were like, keep doing this until it stops working, you know?
Yeah, I know I asked that as part of my question because those are the ones that always just stand out. Like I just feel like I see them every time I log on Instagram as Tom holding that whiteboard, which is why I was curious. And so, what were you guys using as your KPIs? Like, what was kind of your goal with the social media? Was it just purely to grow social to get more awareness? Was it like, were you looking at when we post this, does a podcast downloads increase by this percent? Like, what were you guys using as KPIs to evaluate your performance on social?
Yeah, it was growth. It's funny, like, Tom was, like, all about just, like, we need to grow as fast as possible, you know? Um, and so growth, like, follower growth was number 1, but, like, kind of like the metric, like, the trackable metric for that, that I found had the highest like, the biggest influence on growth were, um, like, the engagement rate was, like, the biggest one as far as, like, the algorithm, like, starting to push out your content. And then it was just like metrics around like how many like a big strategy we used to grow the account was like collaborations with other accounts and paid shout outs as well with like pages that made sense for the audience. So just like metrics around that.
And in terms of follower growth, like when Tom started, he had around 260,000 followers when you started with them, right?
I think it was around 350,000. Yeah.
350. I mean, but even so, like today, we fast forward, that's 1.7 million now, which is just insane growth over that period. What are some of those things that worked best to grow? I've heard you say somewhere that like paying for shout outs on other pages was something you guys noticed worked really, really well. What else kind of helped Tom grow his page?
Yeah, honestly, I mean, it's pretty like it's funny. The answer for like how to grow social is always like pretty boring, you know. But it's like consistent, consistent, really good content, um, and that your audience like really resonates with, you know, like within a certain like you can't just be all over the place. I mean, I think those it's not a bad strategy to kind of be like just authentic and show every part of your life. But like I think if you're really trying to grow, it's like give the audience what they want, you know, which for Tom was like motivational advice and uh yeah. Um but then like you said, like shout outs as well. Like collaborations with other pages. I mean that was those two were really the bread and butter of how we grew the account to I think when I left it was at like 1.5 million.
What about like when he'd have guests on the show on Impact Theory and they would post a clip? Would you see a lot of traction and a lot of crossover from that?
Not really. It's like they were kind of like drops in the bucket. Um yeah, I mean we still did it. We did it regularly obviously here. So we shared the clips. Whenever they did it would grow the account maybe um like 500 followers max, which is significant, but, like, compared to all the other stuff we were doing, like, we were growing like, when in our like, when Instagram when the algorithm was just, like, popping, we were growing, like, 20,000 followers a week.
Oh,
Yeah, it was crazy.
no, I asked because when I started my podcast, like way back, I was like, this is genius. I'm just going to interview people with big followings. They're going to post about my show and like their big audience is going to come to my podcast and it's going to explode in no time, which is obviously super naive when I started it. But so I was just curious if you scale that up from a podcast far bigger than mine, what that looks like when a guest posts about the show. What are some other things that you guys tried that you thought for sure was going to grow it that didn't work?
Um, a good question.